This edition of our podcast is brought to you by 360 Health and Well Balanced Nutrition.
Welcome to the Health Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
Hey, Kristen, can we continue talking about this book called Healthy Gut, Healthy You?
Yes, I would love to, by Dr. Ruscio. And let's talk about what he calls the most impactful intervention for improving your gut and overall health, and that is diet.
And you know, we read a book called, I think it was Mark Hyman's book, Food Fix, but maybe I'm wrong. One of these authors recently said, you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet.
That's true.
So exercise is important, but we're focusing on diet right here.
Absolutely. And you know I love that as a dietitian. I could talk all day about this, but I learned a lot of very interesting things and appreciated a lot that he had on this section. So he walks us through the entire body of evidence around different areas of food, and I'll just say that even though he lays out the evidence pretty clearly, he does repeat several times his belief that the most powerful thing you can do is start listening to your body and stop listening to everything else.
Excellent news.
I love that. And I'm just going to put a shameless plug in here that at Well Balanced Nutrition, as registered dietitians, that is our thing to help you start listening to your body. And if that sounds like a foreign idea, something you want help with, please visit us at wellbalancednutrition.com and connect with us there. We would love to help you out.
So what are we going to use for ears if we're listening?
Well, symptoms and paying attention to how these different foods affect our bodies.
You mean how you feel when you eat them?
Exactly.
Yes, so this ear is really a sense of feeling in it, of well-being.
Yeah, it's funny. We say listening, but we're really just detecting and feeling.
Yeah, but it is foreign. Like you said, this is not something we're brought up when we have a meal, and particularly in the last 30 years, meals have kind of, family meals and taking time with meals has gone to the wayside. And people are grabbing food, eating it, not paying any attention to it, and doing it in as little time as possible to get to the next thing. So listening is, you have to take time to listen.
You do, and you're right. The society and the way we've set up our lives, we're rushing from here to there, and food is often the last thing we think about or slow down to enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's two really interesting things that he points out based on evidence and his practice, what he has learned from working with several people with gut issues that I want to talk to you about today. And one is eating to remove inflammation is more important than feeding our gut with fiber. So we hear so much about fiber, right, and how we need to eat a ton of it, and it's one of my favorite topics. I like to talk to my clients about it. But he brings up that inflammation from our food can be a big issue. He actually recommends that if you're having some gut symptoms, the first line of approach would be to follow a paleo diet.
Yeah, and what's interesting about inflammation is that's our innate, I think he's talking about the innate inflammation, the things that we are designed with, we come into the world with. It's not like a vaccination. It's something that is innate within us. And so when you get an injury, your body is programmed to go through a sequence of events. It's going to dilate the blood vessels. It's going to send the white blood cells out there. It's going to increase the temperature of the area because that blood is warm. So there's going to be a whole lot of local changes with these micro injuries. And what I think, tell me if this is what you understood him to say, if the healthy bacteria are outnumbered by the bad bacteria, and the bad bacteria start injuring that mucosal layer, particularly in the small intestine where there's not as much of it, that's when the small little injury starts and the inflammation starts. It's caused by the bacteria, the unhealthy bacteria. And if we don't pay attention to how to get that microbiota in balance, we can have these, as what I would call subclinical symptoms that you won't detect because you can't feel them, you can't smell them, you can't see them. And if you're not listening to your body, you're not paying attention to them, and then they get out of control.
Right.
Is that what he's saying? It's coming from the bacterial imbalances of dysbiota?
Yeah, and I think what you're referring to is that the breakdown of the mucosal lining that we call leaky gut.
Mm-hmm.
You might have heard that term out there. And that just means that the overgrowth is breaking down what you mentioned in the last podcast, that we have this protective lining in our GI tract to keep the outside world from getting in our body.
Yeah, and there are actually two layers of it. One is really tight up against the epithelial cells where nutrient absorption occurs. The small intestine's job, if we want to give it one, is to absorb the nutrients to get them into the bloodstream, to get them to the individual cells that are doing whatever they're doing. If they're heart cell, brain cell, pancreas, whatever, they need nutrients.
Yeah, and
right?
90% of what we eat is absorbed in the small intestine.
There you go. All right, so if we, so there's two layers. There's one layer really tight up against that's protective. And then there's a thicker mucosal layer, that particularly in the colon, where the bacteria hang out. They live there. They're stuck to the wall. Mm-hmm. So that's good in the large intestine. But in the small intestine, the barriers are not as protective. And so that bacteria can move through the wall, get into that space between cells, and then get into the bloodstream or get into cells. And that's when you get problems. You get bacterial
and that's
toxins everywhere.
Right, and that's where you see sometimes these inflammatory foods can be extra irritating to some people. And the common ones that Dr. Ruscio points out are things like dairy, grains, legumes, and food additives. And those are what mainly are removed in the paleo diet.
Yeah. And as you're talking about that, it made me think of allergens versus intolerance.
It bothers me that he lumps everything into a food allergy, and I think he does that just...
But he says food allergens, similar spectrum of inflammation occurs with food intolerances. So what's the difference between an intolerance and an allergy?
So an allergy is an IgE response, and usually immediate and more severe, and it is not dose dependent.
And those are inflammatory molecules, right?
Yes.
Part of the inflammatory pathway that does all those things I was just talking about. They're going to
the IgE
kick the inflammation going.
Exactly. So
but
it's like
intolerance,
when you're allergic to nuts and you're exposed to a small amount, you're still going to have a reaction.
Yeah.
Now, an intolerance is more like your gut cannot break something down. And then there is something else that he doesn't even mention, which is a food sensitivity. And that is a dose-dependent inflammatory reaction to a food or chemical in our diet.
Okay, good.
And so it bothers me that he, for ease, I think, of the reader, he just says, we'll just call everything a food allergy. And that's not really the case, but I guess for his debate and conversation in the book.
Well, and I think he may do that because I think a lot of providers do that. They don't know the difference between those three things. And so they say, we're going to test you for food allergies, and it's going to cost you this much money, and we're going to do all this. His opinion is they don't need to do all this testing, which is kind of controversial.
It is.
He says you just need to try the food. If it hurts you, don't eat it. Test yourself, with the challenges.
Yeah, he says that testing is useless, and I agree and I disagree. I agree with his approach to try the diets first that are the easiest to implement. Like paleo is fairly simple enough and lots of resources out there. Then he recommends if paleo doesn't work, try low FODMAP, and that is much more complicated. There are lots of dietitians who are trained specifically in helping with the low FODMAP diet.
Okay, hold on.
What is low FODMAP?
Yeah, we're going to have to explain that because it sounds funny when we say it.
I know. So low FODMAP is a diet that eliminates and reduces carbohydrates that normally would feed our healthy gut bacteria, but because of a dysbiosis or a digestive disorder, we need to cut back on those foods. And you were good at saying what they stood for.
Oh,
Eleanor.
yeah, and I want to. Can I?
Yes.
Because when we look at organic chemistry, we look at carbohydrates as a group of organic molecules. And saccharide means sugar. And so little individual saccharides hook together and make longer molecules. And so a complex carbohydrate has a whole lot of these saccharides attached to it. And a simple saccharide would be like a glucose molecule. It's the building block, glucose. Well, anyway, so FODMAP stands for the number of these sugars that are attached to things. So fructo, oligo, FO, D is disaccharide. So oligo is 1, di is 2. No, that's not true. Oligo is many, di is 2, and M is monosaccharide. A stands for and the P stands for polyol, which is a sugar alcohol.
Yeah,
and
cool.
So when we're looking at foods, we're looking at which ones have these fructo, oligo, di-mono, and polyols in them.
And it's very counterintuitive because these foods that contain these carbohydrates are very healthy or known to be healthy for most.
And when people tell you, here's this fad diet and here's what you should eat, you're going to say, which is what you were saying about cultures, one size does not fit all is what we're learning.
Yeah.
But anyway, you would be eliminating broccoli, you would be eliminating beans, you would be eliminating avocados. Who can live without an avocado? Not me.
And onions and garlic.
Yeah, and lots of other foods that sound healthy. But maybe your microbiota can handle those.
Exactly.
But maybe you're the individual that can't. And that's what we need to help you determine.
And, you know, with the low FODMAP diet in general and in Dr. Ruscio's book, the goal is to only eliminate them for a short term to heal the gut. And then you add back in as much as you can tolerate to find what works for you. So he says, try the diet first. And those are the 2 diets that he recommends. And that not to test, but I just want to say here that I don't think he knows about the MRT test. So most functional medicine practitioners I've seen will do a food allergy test or food sensitivity test that is IgG, which I said IgG.
Is it a blood test?
E is for true allergies, and IgG is one pathway, potential pathway for sensitivity. Yes, it's a blood test.
And Ig stands for immunoglobulins, which are very large proteins in our body.
Right. Now, that's what is common, but something that well-balanced nutrition has experience with and many dietitians have experience with is something called the mediator release test. And it is a blood test from Oxford Labs that actually measures the release of inflammatory chemicals in our blood as a result of food or chemical exposure. And there's research that suggests that it'll improve symptoms of IBS, migraine, fibromyalgia, and arthritis. So I don't think that that's a first-line approach, but I disagree with his statement that testing can be pretty useless.
Well, I think what he talks about in this allergy section is we know there are certain things that a lot of people have trouble with. And so the most problematic foods would be those that contain gluten, maybe dairy and soy. And then second to that would be eggs, nuts, and high carb, too many carbs in your diet. And then they're less likely or intruders or disruptors. So I think what he's saying is, since we know a lot of these things, why don't you just eliminate them before you go through the testing? If eliminating them and reintroducing them, you can't figure it out, maybe the testing is a way to go.
And I agree with that, yeah. Well, you brought up gluten. That's a hot topic. And
we got to talk about gluten.
Go into that. Once again, I appreciate his very balanced take on this. And he points out that there are some people that are just so anti-gluten, they think it's evil. And he points out that how can it be evil for all people if there is so much evidence that whole grains can be part of a healthy diet.
Absolutely.
And that are very beneficial in some ways.
But if you're the individual with celiac disease...
Well, you must avoid it if you have celiac disease.
So that not a lot of people have celiac disease, really. I mean, it's not 50% of us, is it?
No.
Yeah.
And so it used to be that either you have celiac or you can tolerate gluten, period. But really we're learning that there's kind of this spectrum of gluten causing inflammation, and you can be sensitive to gluten without a true diagnosis of celiac.
There you go. Yeah.
And it all goes back to, listening to your body and knowing what feels good and what doesn't. So if you avoid gluten and you feel better, great. But if you are fine on gluten, then you don't have to go down that path just because some people think it's evil.
Yeah, and so if your bacteria is disrupted and inflammation starts, your feed, back to the principles he's talking about, you want to feed your gut to reduce inflammation. Another one that he's talking about, which would be celiac disease, right? Mm-hmm. The other one would be to feed your gut to keep your blood sugar under control, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's the second really important point he makes, that managing your blood sugar is more important than getting a ton of fiber for your gut. And pop quiz.
Okay.
What is a prebiotic? Listeners out there, what's a prebiotic? Did you know that prebiotic is a fiber, that all prebiotics are fiber? But not all fiber is prebiotic. Fun fact for you. So when you hear the buzzword prebiotic and probiotic, prebiotic is the fiber that can feed your gut microbes, and probiotics are live cultures that we can ingest, and if they survive down to the gut, can help us have a healthy gut microbiome. So when we have this debate about blood sugar and how he says we need to manage blood sugar, it boils down to carbohydrates and fiber. And there's a lot of controversy about, how much fiber or how much carbohydrates are good for us.
Yeah, and see, fibers are carbohydrates.
Exactly.
Yeah, but they're just structured differently. They're indigestibles. Mm-hmm. And they're things that we don't have the enzymes, digestive juices or pancreatic enzymes to break down, and bacteria can. They like that stuff.
Right. I think of a little Pac-Man in my gut eating the fiber.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens if you have too much of that in your small intestine, and every meal you're just feeding the dysbiosis, the bad bacteria,
overgrowth,
and it keeps growing.
Yeah. And you talked about the ecosystem and the analogy of the gardener, and that idea of watering the garden and the flow of water, draining. If the gut is not moving, things slow. And so there was a theory for a while that by slowing, the toxins that you were trying to expel are poisoning your system. And he's saying, well, let's look at it from the other side. By slowing the system, the bacteria are eating and eating and eating and growing and growing and growing, and you're getting an overgrowth. So I thought that was it wasn't the toxins that he was suggesting are being reabsorbed. It's this bacterial overgrowth that is killing off the beneficial, not killing off, but outcompeting the beneficials, and then moving into the small intestine, finding their way into the small intestine. And that's where we get the bloating, the cramping, the discomfort, the fatigue, these sort of what we would call generalized symptoms that are hard to, when someone comes to a provider and says, I don't feel good. Well, that's very general. Tell me more. Is there a pain in a location? No, I don't feel good. Right. Well, how are you going to figure out where that starts?
Right.
And this guy's saying, let's start with the bacteria. Let's start with the microbiome.
And another great analogy there with what you were going off of was that stagnant water can be really yucky and grow lots of yucky things, but nice flowing stream is much more healthy, and that's what we want, is that motility, things to move through us.
But you're telling me to eat lots of fruits and vegetables, and I know they have fiber in them. So there's insoluble fibers and soluble fibers.
Right, and like you said, fiber is a carbohydrate, and isn't low carbohydrate effective in managing diabetes and all of that jazz? Well, he goes into that, and again, he tells you to listen to your body. You might do really well on a low carbohydrate diet, and he categorizes them. Low carbohydrate diet is 100 grams a day or less. A moderate is 150 grams-ish a day. And then a high carbohydrate diet is greater than 150 grams. And he says, if you have felt great on a low-carb diet, then it might be good for you. If you have diabetes or prediabetes, then the low-carbohydrate diet might be good for you. And then if maybe you're thinner or you're really athletic, you would probably do better with a moderate to high carbohydrate.
But aren't I going to get colon cancer if I don't have a lot of fiber?
Well, he does
Isn't
break
my
that
heart
down,
isn't my heart disease going to be bad if I don't eat my oatmeal?
Well, that's the debate. And the research is, there's research for both ways in the fiber. That whole section on fiber, he breaks it down to the research for fiber and the research against fiber, and within each category, like for IBS, for colon cancer, for heart health. Again, I appreciate that he doesn't just give you an answer based on his opinion. He's like, this is the research, and it's very split, and it really all depends.
Well, he does talk about meta-analysis a lot, which he says is the highest level, I think, of evidence, because those meta-analyses are looking at all the literature on a topic, and there are criteria of inclusion of articles and exclusion of articles. So it's a rigorous, we're not letting every article that's been written into this analysis. We're going to look at the quality articles because they will give us a better thing. And then they apply a number score to them. So they rank these meta-analysis as a level of confidence. So it's a whole nother discipline now of information processing that's developed. These people that write meta-analysis papers, that's a whole career, in my opinion. They don't do much else.
Yeah, and he has hired a team to review. Speaking of a career, he has a whole team reviewing all of this.
Yeah, so as an example, he says a meta-analysis of 14 clinical trials found that dietary fiber consumption caused a slight but significant decrease in the inflammation marker C-reactive protein. Many of the fibers were derived from grain. 8 of the 14 studies used fibers containing gluten. So that's the kind of conversation he gets into. So if you're the kind of reader that wants to get into some detail, this author is going to take you on a pretty interesting discussion and lead you in a very logical way through it with his question and answer method.
Yes, very fascinating, very easy to read.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk about food additives?
Can we talk about one more thing on carbs real quick?
Yeah.
So what did you think about this whole comment that if you're from northern descent versus equatorial descent, that your carbohydrate needs might be different? So the northern descent, he suggests, might do better on lower carbohydrate diets. I'm
willing to go down that road. I didn't think it was anything that I would say that sounds goofy. I think evolutionarily those gene pools have responded to dietary patterns and microbes in their areas. Mm-hmm. Now that we've started traveling and mixing it all up, I'm not sure how long that's going to hold, because we're bringing products are carrying microbes and people are carrying microbes, and then they come to a new location. So over time, if they stay put, it might change. But if we keep moving around, we may end up with a standardized gut microbiome. I don't know.
Interesting.
But it was going to take eons for that to occur. So in the short term, I'm thinking if my heritage is Scandinavian, I might try that diet and see how I feel. And if I feel good on it, I might just live that way.
Yeah.
Living here in the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I looked into this, and another way to talk about it is called carbohydrate tolerance. And it's that they found it's determined by your genes and related to the amount of amylase you have in your mouth.
There we go. We got the mouth.
That's
See,
right.
He should have put the mouth in this book. Oral cavity, to be specific.
And that's what starts the breakdown of carbohydrates. So if you're breaking down carbohydrates easier in your mouth, then you're tolerating them and you can have them more. So that was really interesting. I was curious to know what you thought about that. But such a good point that, if we keep moving around, that could play a role eventually.
Yeah, but I think the moving around and introducing yourself into a different dietary pattern area could be a health disadvantage for you. And that's what I think we're seeing with the introduction of westernized food products into Asian countries in particular. Okinawa is one of the blue zones, Dan Buettner's Blue Zone, Okinawans, and it's referenced in several of these mind gut books that we're reading. But it's changing because we've brought the McDonald's and the high-fat beefs and a more frequency of meats. That's something. How often do you eat these things?
Right.
Is it every meal or is it occasionally?
And that brings us back to food additives.
Yes, it does. Let's talk
processed foods.
Yeah, which most of our authors that we're reading say not a good idea.
No, and what's interesting to me is that all of the emulsifiers and preservatives that are in our food, and they're in like bottled salad dressings and packaged crackers
to extend the shelf life.
To extend the shelf life.
Yeah, and what does it change into while it's on the shelf?
So he mentions that the emulsifiers, there are a few studies out there that are linking the emulsifiers to that breakdown of the mucosal lining of the intestine. And so that's one of the things that goes in the paleo diet, which I like. That's the first line of approach in his book. And it gets rid of those food additives. Another food additive he talks about is artificial sweeteners.
Oh, that's one of my hot buttons right there. I just talked to somebody the other day, and they said, I'm going to put a little aspartame. They didn't call it aspartame, but it's the one that had NutraSweet. Yeah, Sweet and Low, yeah. And I thought, just eat the sugar. Just eat the sugar. It's not going to hurt you. I know. But the whole reason I think the food industry has gone to the artificial sweeteners as heavily as it has is for calorie reduction, which we know that we eat too many calories perhaps. But in an effort to do that, the evidence is we're not learning to not crave sweets. By giving us an artificial sweetener, we still want that sweet thing, and we just should learn not to want sweets so often. If you don't have them often, you don't want them that much. It's a craving cycle that gets started. And so with the artificial sweeteners, you're bringing in something that you do not have a daily recommended requirement for, those chemicals. And the evidence is you may end up gaining weight anyway.
And they're multiple times sweeter than sugar you would find in nature.
We got to curve it, just rewire your desires.
Yeah, and the evidence points to it increasing your appetite when you have those artificial sweeteners.
Yeah, and we've seen them since they've been introduced in the American market in processed foods. We have not had a downturn in our obesity epidemic.
Well, confession, I've had a sweet tooth all my life, and I love stevia.
That's natural. I'm okay with that. I can go down that road.
Dr. Ruscio even warns against those, but yeah, it is a more natural sweetener. But you're right. Like, ideally, we retrain our taste buds to not want sweets all the time. Easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it can be a brutal exercise to get there.
One thing that Well Balanced Nutrition does to help with this is we help people meal plan and get in the kitchen and cook more natural, whole food meals. So check out wellbalancednutrition.com for more information.
And as 360health4u.com, Eleanor, one of the things that my healthy lifestyle promotion includes is the idea of eating whole foods and helping people reset their dietary patterns. And we offer a kickstart or a fresh start or a reset process where we help people test their palate with whole foods and reset the cravings and get better sleep, and then redesign their diet going forward if they can. So we're kind of working with the gut microbiota as well. So check us out at 360health4u.com. Are we going to wrap this book up, or do you want to do another little episode next time?
I don't know. We'll have to see.
Let's do another one, because I want to talk about stress and adrenal fatigue. So let's do that in the next podcast.
All right. Well, stay tuned. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
The views and opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the expressed written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.